Join me as I dive into 3 true, scary hospital horror stories, and let's see if I can make it through without getting too freaked out. From ghostly apparitions to eerie encounters, these tales will have you questioning what really goes on behind those sterile hospital walls. So, grab a seat and prepare for a spine-chilling journey. You won't want to miss this.
Story 1.
The Vanishing Patient. It was a quiet night at St. Margaret's Hospital. The dim lights flickered slightly as Nurse Clara adjusted the front desk. Her shift was uneventful, just the way she liked it. The emergency room had calmed, and most patients had drifted into sleep. But when an elderly man with pale, almost translucent skin was wheeled into the ER, Clara couldn't help but feel a twinge of unease. He had been brought in after collapsing outside the hospital entrance. His name was Thomas O'Neill, a man in his late 80s with a severe heart condition according to the emergency paperwork. Clara noted that he was conscious but barely able to speak, his breathing shallow and ragged. She quickly assigned him to room 307, setting up an IV drip and monitoring his heart rate. He muttered something about darkness and the trees, but Clara thought it was just delirium. The night passed slowly, and Clara checked on him every hour. His condition worsened, but despite his critical state, she couldn't help but notice how unnervingly calm he appeared. His eyes were wide open but unblinking, staring straight ahead as though waiting for something. Hours passed, and Clara's shift was nearing its end. As she entered room 307 for her final check, she was hit with an unsettling chill. The bed was empty. She froze. The room was untouched, save for the faint traces of the sheets, which had been neatly tucked as if the patient had never been there at all. His chart, the one she'd filled out earlier, was gone. The IV pole stood alone, the bag of saline still half full. There was no sign of struggle, no sign of anything out of the ordinary, except that Thomas O'Neill had vanished. Clara immediately checked the security footage. The footage showed Thomas walking into the hospital entrance earlier that night, supported by 2 staff members. He shuffled slowly but with purpose. But then the footage stopped abruptly. It was as though the man had simply disappeared. She rewound the tape, fast-forwarded, but there was no trace of him leaving. The doors didn't open again. No one had seen him exit. Panic crept in as Clara checked the patient's medical records. There were no records of him being admitted. The staff who had helped bring him in were baffled. The ER log showed no entry for Thomas O'Neill at all. But then, one of the orderlies mentioned something chilling. There was a rumour among the hospital staff that the night shift had always been strange. Some said they'd heard strange noises late at night, like whispering voices coming from the empty hallways, or seeing flickering shadows in rooms where patients had died long ago. Most dismissed it as hospital myths, but Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As she sat alone in the break room later that morning, her eyes caught an old, yellowed newspaper in the corner of the room. It was a piece of local history, detailing strange disappearances in the area decades ago. She flipped through it, and suddenly, her hand froze. An obituary. Thomas O'Neill, a man who had died in a car accident 40 years ago, exactly in the same year he had supposedly been admitted to the hospital. But that wasn't the worst part. The obituary mentioned that he had been last seen walking near the woods before the crash. She remembered what he had whispered before he passed out. The trees. A deep sense of dread washed over Clara. The man who had checked in that night, who or what, had truly walked into room 307. It seemed St. Margaret's Hospital had more ghosts than just the ones from the past.
Story 2.
The elevator that moves on its own. Dr. Michael Novak was no stranger to late nights at the hospital. The hum of the fluorescent lights, the soft shuffle of nurses' shoes, and the distant echo of machines monitoring the sick kept him company as he worked. It was well past midnight when he realized he'd forgotten some crucial paperwork in the basement morgue. He sighed, rubbed his eyes, and made his way to the staff elevator, the only means of access to the lower floors after hours. The elevator was old, its metallic frame scratched and dulled, the once bright lights flickering intermittently. Dr. Novak pressed the button for the basement and waited, tapping his fingers impatiently on his clipboard. The doors slid open with a wheeze, and a blast of cold air rushed out. It was an unnatural chill, the kind that seemed to seep through your bones. Frowning, the doctor stepped inside, the door shutting with a soft clunk behind him. He pressed the button to descend, but nothing happened. The display above the door blinked erratically, stuck between floors. He tapped the button again, then checked the control panel, his fingers brushing over the outdated buttons. It wasn't like the hospital to have such problems, especially on such an important lift. Suddenly, he heard it, an almost imperceptible sound from behind him, a slow, wheezing breath. His heart skipped a beat, his eyes snapping toward the darkened doorway leading into the morgue. There was nothing, no sound, no movement. He stepped out of the elevator and peered into the darkness, the dim light from the elevator casting long shadows over the cold, sterile space. His breath came out in a cloud, and he shivered, though it wasn't from the cold. There was something off. The air felt thick, as though it were pressing down on him, pushing him deeper into the stillness. A low, breathy sigh echoed behind him. The sound was closer now, almost right next to him. His pulse quickened, and he spun around, expecting to find a colleague, perhaps a nurse or janitor who had come to check on the place. But there was no one. Just the silence and the cold. The lights flickered again, casting a brief, haunting glow on the long rows of metal drawers. The morgue stretched on, empty and frozen in time. Dr. Novak's heart raced. He turned back to the elevator, intending to leave, but the doors refused to open. The control panel blinked once more, and then, in an instant, the elevator began to move on its own. He watched, horrified, as the elevator slowly ascended. The doors remained shut, and the faint, cold breath that had followed him seemed to grow fainter with every passing second. He stood frozen, his mind unable to comprehend what was happening, the only sound the elevator's creaking ascent. The doors finally opened, but there was no one inside, only the empty, vacant space. Dr. Novak stepped forward, looking into the elevator's quiet emptiness. Had the elevator really moved on its own, or was it something else? Something not quite alive.
Story 3.
The ghostly code blue. Late at night, when the hospital was quiet, with only the faint glow of hallway lights flickering, something unsettling happened in the emergency room. A patient suddenly flatlined. The monitors beeped urgently, signaling the end. Doctors and nurses rushed to resuscitate him, applying chest compressions, using defibrillators. The seconds felt like hours. His heart wasn't beating. Everything pointed to him being beyond saving. A young nurse, Sarah, stood nearby, her hands shaking as she watched the monitor. She knew that if they didn't do something now, he wouldn't make it. The medical team worked in perfect synchronization, but nothing seemed to be working. Then, just when hope seemed lost, the monitor blared to life. His heart began to beat again. The patient coughed and gasped for air, regaining consciousness, but his eyes were filled with confusion and fear. Before anyone could speak, he whispered, "She said it's not my time yet." Sarah froze, wide-eyed. Who? Who are you talking about?" He blinked several times as if still trying to clear his head. A nurse. She was wearing an old uniform from the 1950s. He stared blankly ahead, as though seeing something none of them could see. Sarah exchanged a glance with Dr. Johnson, who had been working at the hospital for over 30 years. He frowned and asked, "Can you describe her?" The patient described her in such detail that it sent a chill down Sarah's spine. She wore a white uniform with a square collar, and her hair was neatly tied up at the back. She looked at me with such gentle eyes, like she knew I wasn't supposed to die. Sarah felt an icy shiver run down her spine. She quickly turned to Dr. Johnson, who looked just as stunned. "That sounds just like Nora," he murmured. Nora had been a nurse at the hospital decades ago, but tragically, she had died in this very room, under mysterious circumstances, over 40 years ago. No one could explain her death, but the legend of Nora, the nurse who had died while tending to a patient, had lingered in the halls. Her spirit was said to still haunt the place, though no one had ever really believed it. Sarah couldn't help but feel an unease settle in her chest. As she walked out of the room to look up more information, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. That night, as she pulled up Nora's old records, she found a picture of the very same nurse the patient had described, wearing the same 1950s uniform. It was a photo taken in the room where the patient had been revived, the same room where Nora had died. The coincidence was too much to ignore. When Sarah returned to the patient's room, he was asleep, but there was an undeniable air of mystery in the room, a chill in the air that seemed to come from nowhere. The next morning, the patient was fully awake and alert. He had no memory of anything strange happening during the night, but when he was told what he had said about the nurse, he seemed disturbed. "I don't know what I saw," he said softly, "but I know she was there. And I know I'm still alive because of her." As Sarah and Dr. Johnson continued to discuss the strange events, Sarah couldn't stop thinking about the question that lingered in her mind. Was Nora's ghost still watching over patients, intervening at the exact moment they were about to die? Or was this all just a trick of the mind, a product of the near-death experience? Whatever the truth was, one thing was certain. There was something deeply unsettling about the idea that not all souls left the hospital when they passed on. Have you ever had a strange experience in a hospital? Share your story in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more chilling tales that will keep you up at night. You never know what might be lurking in the shadows, just beyond the reach of the living.